Chapter 1. The Silence of the Shrines. The bells of the Temple of Akatosh did not ring that morning. For centuries they had sounded with dawn's first light, their bronze voices calling Cyrodiil's faithful to prayer. But now the air above the white gold tower lay still, heavy with the unbroken hush of an abandoned sanctuary. The incense smoldered to grey ash, its scent fading beneath the cold draught that slipped through cracked marble windows. Thalen Direnni, scholar of the Arcane University, stood among the priests of Akatosh, his hands folded within his robes. Before him, a young acolyte pressed his palms against the great altar of the dragon god, whispering the words of a restoration rite. No light answered him, no shimmer of gold, no warmth of divine mercy. The boy's eyes quivered with disbelief as his prayer dissolved into the air like mist. All across the heartlands, it was the same. From the Cathedral of Dibella in Anvil to the hidden shrines of Mara in the Nibene marshes, blessings faltered and miracles ceased. Pilgrims reported that their sacred relics had grown dull to the touch. Priests dreamed of empty halls where once the voices of the gods resounded. The divines, it seemed, had turned away. Thalen had spent his years studying the threads that bound Mundus to the Aetherius. He knew of the Aedra, those who had given their very essence to shape the mortal plane. To imagine them fading was to imagine the unraveling of the world itself. Yet the evidence before him was undeniable. Faith had become a whisper, and the Aedra no longer answered. He left the temple at dusk, crossing the quiet streets of the imperial city. Merchants closed their stalls early. Even the beggars had fallen silent, glancing warily toward the cloud-wrapped spire of the tower. Thalen's thoughts turned to the old Direnni texts, fragments his ancestors had salvaged from the ruins of Balfiera. They spoke of a time when the flow between worlds could weaken, when the light of Aetherius dimmed and the stars themselves trembled. That night, in his chamber overlooking Lake Rumar, Thalen opened his journals and began to record the first signs of what he would later call the dimming. His quill scratched across the parchment in fevered strokes. Temple reports, failed invocations, celestial readings. The patterns pointed to something vast, something deliberate. As the moon rose, he looked out upon the water, and for a fleeting instant, the reflection of the stars wavered, as if the sky itself had exhaled a weary sigh. The world felt hollow, like a shell from which the spirit had departed. And deep within his heart, Thalen knew that the silence was not mere absence, but a warning. The gods were not gone. They were being drawn away. Chapter 2. Whispers in the Ether. The journey to the Somerset Isles took Thalen across grey, heaving seas and beneath skies bruised by storms. The winds from the Abyssian carried the scent of salt and lightning, and he felt as though the very air resisted his passage. When his ship finally anchored near the alabaster harbours of Alinor, dawnlight spilled over the crystalline spires like molten silver. Yet beneath the brilliance of the Altmer capital, Thalen sensed unease, a faint vibration, like a string stretched too thin. The Psijic order had recalled itself to Artaeum years ago, hidden once more from the sight of the world. Yet Thalen had received a summons, penned in a script that shimmered faintly with magicka, bidding him come to the island through means known only to initiates. Guided by the sea and the strange pull of the note, he found himself one night standing upon the pale sands of Artaeum, as if stepping from one dream into another. The air there was different, thicker, luminous, alive. Magic drifted like unseen pollen. Trees whispered names older than speech. He was met by a Psijic adept, robed in azure and silver, whose face seemed ageless and weary. Without a word, the adept led him through marble courtyards lined with starlit fountains, toward a vast observatory crowned with mirrors of glass and crystal. Within, an elder Psijic, Master Larethian, awaited. His eyes, pale as dawn mist, reflected the swirling void captured within the great orrery above them, planets and stars turning in silent procession. "For you have come seeking the Aedra," the old mage said at last. "But tell me, scholar of Cyrodiil, what if they are no longer looking back?" He raised his staff, and the orrery darkened. Where light should have danced from the plain of Aetherius, there was instead a deep, pulsing void, a hollow where once the radiance of the divines streamed freely into Mundus. "Our scryings reach into nothing," Larethian whispered. Aetherius answers with silence. The flow between realms falters, and the stars grow pale. For days, Thalen studied beside the Psijics, poring over maps of celestial ley lines and treatises older than the Empire itself. He saw evidence of ruptures, faint fractures in the luminous fabric that bound the mortal world to its makers. Even the island trembled faintly, its magic currents flickering like a dying fire. One night, while alone in the observatory, Thalen attuned himself to the great crystal lens. He reached outward, not with his mind, but with something deeper, the part of the soul that remembers the dawn of creation. For a moment he felt it, the hum of the ether, faint and receding, as though retreating beyond the edges of being. And in that vanishing echo, a whisper, not divine but wounded, brushed his thoughts. The covenant phrase, the sacrifice wanes. He tore himself from the trance, breath ragged, the taste of starlight burning on his tongue. The Aedra were not merely fading, they were being unbound. Chapter 3. The Forgotten Covenant. The roads of Valenwood wound beneath canopies of jade and gold, their shadows deep and restless. Thalen traveled alone, guided by the scent of moss and river mist, and by the faint pull of memory that lingered from his visions on Artaeum. He had learned that the silence of the Aedra was not a mere absence, but the unraveling of an ancient accord, one that even the Psijics spoke of only in half-remembered whispers, the covenant that bound the divines to Mundus through mortal faith. He sought its truth in the ruins of Elden Root, where Bosmeri scholars preserved records older than the Empire. Within a library grown from living wood, he found scrolls written in a tongue that shimmered and shifted with each breath. They told of the Dawn era, when the gods had given form to the world through sacrifice, of how their essence had mingled with mortal spirit, creating a bond both fragile and eternal. The covenant, it said, was not forged by will alone, but by belief. As mortals remembered and honored the gods, so too were the Aedra anchored within the mortal plane. Yet the faith of men and Mer had fractured. In Cyrodiil, priests quarreled over doctrine. In Skyrim, old shrines were left to rot beneath the snow. Even among the Altmer, who once revered their divine ancestry, worship had become ceremony without heart. The covenant weakened not from assault, but from neglect, corroded by indifference and pride. But there was more. A hidden passage in one scroll spoke of a poisoning, a shadow that seeped into the channels of faith, severing the connection from both ends. The text spoke of a being born from the void between creation and unmaking, a reflection of divine power turned inward. Its purpose, to consume reverence and replace it with despair. Thalen's pulse quickened as he traced the runes. It was not only mortals who had forgotten their makers. Something was feeding upon that forgetting, widening the chasm between Mundus and Aetherius. The covenant was being unwritten. That night in the heart of the Tree City, Thalen performed a minor invocation to test what remained of the bond. He whispered the name of Arkay and pressed his palm to the living bark. Once such a call would have filled him with the steady hum of balance and renewal. Now he felt only a faint trembling, as though the world itself struggled to remember what it once was. Thunder rolled in the distance, a strange sound in the forest's endless hush. The leaves stirred, carrying voices not of mortals but of something vast and sorrowful. For the briefest moment, Thalen sensed countless eyes gazing through the fabric of the world, their light dimmed, their words lost. When he woke from that waking dream, a single phrase burned upon the parchment before him, written in ink not his own. Faith is the thread that binds eternity. When it frays, even gods may fall. Chapter 4. The Heart Beneath Nirn. Snow fell thick upon the Geralt Mountains as Thalen crossed into Skyrim, its cold cutting to the marrow. The wind howled through broken passes, carrying with it the scent of stone and ancient ruin. Beneath the pale auroras, he followed the map he had pieced together from the Bosmeri scrolls and Psijic charts, a convergence of ley lines pointing toward a Dwemer ruin long sealed beneath the earth. Locals called it Nchul Zel Var, the deep vault of echoes. He found its entrance half buried beneath centuries of frost and moss, the brass doors frozen shut. With a gesture of magicka and a whispered word of unlocking, the seals shuddered and gave way. The breath of the deep exhaled, warm, metallic, and old, like the sigh of a forgotten god. Torchlight revealed the inner halls, walls etched with tonal glyphs that shimmered faintly, pulsing to some unseen rhythm. The Dwemer had vanished long ago, but their machines still murmured in the dark. Thalen descended through chambers of whirring gears and silent sentinels. Strange harmonics filled the air, a music of metal and light, resonating in the bones more than in the ears. At the core of the ruin lay a great dome, its ceiling pierced by a shaft of crystal that caught and refracted the faint glow of his torch into a lattice of stars. In the center stood a massive sphere of gold and glass, an orrery unlike any he had seen. Around it, etched in the Dwemer's precise geometry, spiraled symbols not of their making. They were older, etched by beings who had shaped Mundus itself. The Aedra's runes. He approached and felt a hum beneath his boots, deep and resonant, as though the mountain itself had a heartbeat. The tonal machinery was alive, feeding upon something vast and unseen. And in its rhythm, Thalen recognized a terrible truth. The Dwemer had once tapped into the same divine lattice that bound the Aedra to the mortal world. They had sought to replicate it, to build a mechanism that could channel the power of creation without the need for faith. The ruin was a mirror of the covenant itself, divine structure translated into artifice. And now, as the gods faded, the heart of this forgotten machine pulsed with stolen resonance, like a heart still beating long after its body had died. Thalen laid his hand upon the brass surface of the sphere, and visions tore through him. He saw 1,000 years of light and loss, the Aedra's essence bleeding into the cracks of the world. He saw the Dwemer's last moments, their souls unbound by their own hubris, vanishing into the silence between worlds. And beneath it all, something stirred, an unseen force, vast and cold, drawing divine essence down into the earth, feeding upon the dying breath of gods. He staggered back, gasping, his skin glowing faintly where he had touched the sphere. The lines of magicka that threaded through the ruin dimmed, flickered, and then stilled. The silence that followed was not emptiness, but the pause of something listening. Thalen understood then that the fading of the Aedra was no accident of waning faith alone. It was the work of an ancient design, born in the deep places of Nirn. And somewhere beneath the world's crust, the heart of that design still beat, patient and hungry. Chapter 5. The Veil. Between Worlds. From Skyrim's frozen vaults, Thalen descended into the southern marshes, where reality thinned like breath upon glass. The swamps of Blackwood were hushed beneath a crimson dusk, their waters black and still, reflecting a sky that trembled as if unsure of its own shape. He had followed the faint resonance that bled from the Dwemer machine, tracing it through old ley lines, through the veins of Nirn itself, until it converged here at the edge of nothing. Legends spoke of a rift where the planes brushed together, a scar left from some ancient war of gods and princes. The locals called it the Weeping Hollow. Even the Hist whispered of it with dread, their sap trembling when one spoke its name. As Thalen neared, the air grew heavy with whispers, voices neither mortal nor divine, murmuring through the reeds in tones of grief and hunger. He reached the hollow as night fell. A great mirror of stagnant water spread before him, rippling with a light that came from nowhere. And in its depths, something vast moved, slow, rhythmic, deliberate. The boundary between Mundus and oblivion had thinned to a veil of breath. He felt it pulse with every heartbeat, as though the world itself struggled to hold its shape. Then, from the water, a form began to rise, fluid, formless, stitched together from stolen divinity. It bore no face, yet Thalen felt its gaze pierce him. Not Daedra, not Aedra, something between, born from the bleeding of one realm into another. Its voice filled the air like the tolling of 1,000 cracked bells. They gave their essence and you forgot them, so I drink what remains. The entity's form shifted, rippling with images of broken temples, abandoned altars, silent stars. It was feeding upon the unraveling of the covenant, upon the despair that had replaced faith. It was the shadow he had read of, the reflection of creation itself, born from neglect and longing. Thalen lifted his staff, and light burst from its tip. Ethereal, defiant, burning with every prayer ever spoken. The air screamed as the light clashed against the void. For a heartbeat, he glimpsed the Aedra beyond the veil, pale shapes of fire and sorrow, straining toward the world they had made. Their hands reached, but the shadow's pull was stronger. He understood then what must be done. The covenant could not be restored by prayer alone. It required sacrifice as it had at the dawn of time. He pressed his hand to the water, letting the light within him flow outward, into the wounded fabric between worlds. Agony filled him, the kind that unmade thought. The entity recoiled, its form collapsing into mist, screaming not in rage, but in hunger denied. When dawn came, the hollow was still. The veil had mended, though faintly. The divine's presence, long distant, shimmered again upon the wind, weak but alive. The Aedra were not restored, yet neither were they lost. And upon the marsh's edge, where the last of the fog rose toward the sun, a single line was carved into the mud by unseen hands. Faith rekindled, not remembered, binds the worlds anew. Thalen Direnni was never seen again. But in every temple of Tamriel, the bells rang once more.